Hey everyone, this is Kevin from the chesswebsite.com, and today we're going to be going over the bishop's opening. It starts out with e4, e5, and bishop to c4. Someone recently reached out and requested I do this opening, and my initial thought was, surely I've done this over the last 11 years. Pretty common opening. I just thought for sure I'd already done a video on this, but I had not. So today we are going to right that wrong and make a video on the bishop's opening. Now, a lot of people, after they play e4, e5, they always think, yes, knights before bishops, and so knight to f3 is way more popular than bishop to c4, but there's a lot of play that you can have with bishop to c4. We're going to be looking at the three main lines that you will see from black. That is knight to f6, knight to c6, and then bishop here to c5. The first variation we are going to look at is knight to f6, attacking the pawn here on e4. So pretty common response from white would be to play knight to c3, and then black's going to play bishop to c5, bishop down here to b4, attacking that knight, maybe even knight to c6, just getting more of the knights involved into the center of the game here. The way I like to approach this is to play the Ursov Gambit, and that is to play pawn to d4. Now, I have a separate video I did on this particular variation, so if you want to look more into this gambit, I'll have a link in the description below as well as at the end of this video. But the two main ways that you may see black approach this is the pawn takes here or the knight takes here on e4. Now, if the pawn takes here, well, we're always going to be playing knight to f3, attacking this pawn here on d4. And they may play bishop to c5 to protect that, maybe knight to c6 to protect that, or just say, you know what, we're just taking all the central pawns from white. We're going to play knight takes here on e4. So those are the things you may see. If you bishop to c5, then we're going to push forward with e5, and this really starts to put a lot of pressure on black because there's not a lot of great squares that black can go to before white can really put a lot of pressure on them. Knight comes back here to g8, and then all of a sudden knight to g5, and now the knight and the bishop are both attacking this pawn here on f7, which is extremely weak because the black king is the only piece defending it. So maybe pawn to d5, trying to open up the center of the board as well as attack this bishop. White can actually take here with en passant. This is a real move. White has one move and one move only where they can take with en passant here. And so this still allows for a strong attack. So, you know, now they're almost relegated to play this knight to h6 to defend this f7 square. Queen to e2 check, king over here to f8. Have lost the right to castle on the king side anymore. Pawn takes here on c7. Things just go extremely bad. So maybe they realize that the knight coming back here to g8 right away isn't going to solve their problems. If they just play d5 right away, well, now I think white can just take here on f6. And yes, they could take our bishop as well. But now queen to e2, bishop to e6. Don't think there's another option that black has here. But then we play pawn takes here on g7. They play rook to g8. And then bishop here, g5, just getting more pieces involved into the action. This is queen check here. So many threats that white has here. I really, really like this setup. If we come back, maybe they don't play that bishop here to c5. Maybe instead they play knight to c6. Okay, from here, we can just push forward with pawn to e5. Sometimes if you play pawn to e5, they'll play queen to e7 because they recognize, yes, you can take that knight, but if we pin it down to your king, then you're not able to do that. In this case, we're just going to play castle on the king side. If they take our pawn, we're just going to take. If they take with their queen, we're going to play rook over here to e1. Knight down to e4, really the only logical move, but then pawn to f4, attacking the queen, we start to have a pretty strong attack here. Now, one thing to keep in mind that if they just come over here, maybe queen to f5, maintaining pressure on this f4 square, as well as still controlling the center of the board, you really need to be extremely aggressive. And it looks pretty weird to play pawn to g4 here because you have both your pawns on the f and the g file that have pushed up, and there's so much room in front of your king. There's no protection. But you have the advantage. You need to continue to keep attacking. So if they come back to, g6, we have f5 attacking the queen. Queen comes back here to c6. And then we play queen to d3. Maybe pawn to d5, attacking the bishop. If they do, though, this would be a huge mistake because bishop to b5 pins the queen down to the king. So pawn to d5 is not really an option for them. And so when you think about the pawn can't come down to d5, how do they really protect this knight here on e4? This is going to get captured by the rook or the queen right here on d3. So very, very difficult for black to hold on to this position. And because of that, this king here on g1 is not under any immediate threats. And white has so much more material attacking the opponent that they should have a pretty good game in this spot. Now, instead of playing queen to e7 after we push forward with pawn to e5, they don't have to play their queen. They could also just move their knight since the knight's under attack. Knight to g4, attacking this pawn. We are just going to castle on the king side. And they can't really take it here because our next move is going to be rook here to e1 regardless. But now we can just take, and after they take, we're going to play rook here to e1, pinning down that knight here. But even with something, pawn to d6 doesn't really matter because our next move is going to be pawn to f4. Attacking the knight can't move. It is pinned down, and so this knight is going to fall. Now, instead of early on, maybe instead of knight to c6 in this spot, maybe they just decide to take additional material. Knight takes here on e4. Now, yes, white is down 2 pawns of material, but they can immediately just get back one of those pawns right here. Queen takes here on d4, and white has a lot more material involved into the game. And this is one of those situations where, this is the Urusov Gambit, so you are giving up a pawn for a very, very strong attack. And so you're attacking the knight. Knight usually is going to come back to f6. It can try to get creative with maybe knight to c5, but I don't know that that's going to be a very strong option for them. So maybe knight to f6. They've moved this knight around a lot here. It came out here to f6, then it came down to e4, then it's come back to f6. They really haven't moved any of their other pieces. We can play knight to c3, and you can see we have a pretty good setup. We have both of our bishops that can easily get involved into the game. We're already attacking this f7 square. We can play knight to g5 to put a lot of pressure on this f7 square. We can get our dark square bishop involved into the game, pin down that knight. We can castle on the queen side if we want a very strong attack on this d file. We can castle on the king side if we want to. So a lot of different options that white has in this spot. So those are some of the things you might see in the Urusov Gambit if they play pawn takes here on d4. But they could also just take with their knight here on e4. We're always going to be taking this pawn on e5. But one thing you have to keep in mind is when you play pawn takes here on e5, part of the reason they played knight to e4 is they're looking to play queen to h4, potentially because this is putting a lot of pressure on the king side. If you see this, you need to immediately take here on f7. If not, you are going to have a very, very rude awakening because once this knight moves, then your bishop is going to be under attack. So bishop takes here on f7 after the king takes. Now you can play pawn to g3, forcing the queen to move. And because it's off of this 4th rank here, now the queen can come to d5, check. And then after either the king moves or the queen moves, does not matter. The queen can come back and take that knight here on e4. So always make sure that you do take that pawn here on f7 first before you do anything else. Now, if they want to attack the pawn here, maybe the queen down here to h4 is maybe not on their roadmap here, but maybe queen to e7, attacking the pawn. I recommend playing knight to f3. You can try to get cute with queen to e2. I just don't think it's nearly as strong as knight to f3, holding down this pawn. Now, and not only are they attacking this pawn, but they're also threatening the move queen to b4. If they do this, we'll need to be playing knight to d2 because if there is an exchange, knight takes here on d2. It does stop the check here, but also defends this bishop here on c4. So you don't want to recapture here because you're just going to lose that bishop. So always make sure that you recapture with your knight here on d2. somewhat of a tricky spot because you do want to get your dark square bishop involved into the game, but you definitely need to make sure that you are protecting this bishop here on c4. Now, they may not decide to get their queen involved into the game. Instead, they could just play knight to c6, attacking this pawn. If this is the case, we're going to play bishop takes on f7. This is one of the reasons you play the bishop's opening, is because you want the fastest attack to this f7 square. You want to sacrifice material and you want to be chasing your opponent's king around the board as much as possible. So if they do this, hey, you take right here. Now you can play queen up here to d5, check, and then after they move, you're going to take this knight here on e4. So that's really what you're going to be thinking about if they come down with their knight to e4, is how can you sacrifice your bishop and then immediately take their knight here on e4. The next variation we are going to look at is knight to c6 after the bishop's opening. Now, you have a couple options here. The first one would be to play knight to f3. This is the Italian game, so if you like playing the Italian game, then you can just easily get into this opening. If you say, hey, the whole reason I'm watching this video is I don't like the Italian game, show me a different option, well, you're in luck, because that's exactly what I will show you. So pawn to d3 is my recommendation here, and part of the reason I like pawn to d3 is it almost invites my opponent to play bishop to b4. Sometimes my opponents don't always know exactly what they're going to do, and so if you can invite them into lines that you like, that encourages them to go down a path that's going to be beneficial for you. In this case, we're just playing pawn to c3. If they come back to, let's say, a5, I really like the move pawn to a4. And the reason for that is it doesn't look like it's an immediate threat, but it actually is an immediate threat. So if they play, knight to f6, which would be a huge mistake, they're actually going to lose material. Pawn to b4, attacking the bishop comes back here to b6, and you can see that material is going to fall here. So while a4 doesn't look like it's immediately attacking this bishop, it actually is. So I like to put as much pressure on my opponent to not just think one move ahead, but a couple moves ahead to see where my threat is. So in this case, they could play, pawn to a6 to prepare for the bishop coming back here to b6 and then a7. But now I can just play queen or bishop here to e3 and continue to attack this dark square diagonal here. Now, if they don't come back to a5, they could just play bishop to c5. That's fine as well. Pawn to b4. If they come back to b6, because they could always come back to e7, that's fine as well. But now a4, and it's really just forcing their hand. They have to play something like pawn to a6, or else they are going to lose material. Now, if they don't play their bishop out here to b4, maybe knight to f6. In this case, I'm just going to be playing knight to c3. May not be the most exciting opening, but we still can get our dark square bishop involved into the game pretty easily. Then we could play queen up here to d2, castle on the queen side if we want to. We can castle on the king side. We still have options at some point if we wanted to push forward with f4. We could play knight to f3 at some point, so we still have lots of options that we want. The last variation we are going to look at is bishop here to c5. Now, this is another variation where you have options. If you really like the Gioco piano, you could play knight to f3, because more than likely your opponent's going to play knight to c6. This is something where you say, no, I don't like this. I want to avoid this at all costs. I have another option for you. I've seen some other people recommend some other lines here. I really like the move queen to g4. Now, usually people are not going to recommend getting their queens into the game very early, but I think in the bishop's opening, it does make sense. And the main reason I like it is because the way I see people play against queen to g4. Almost everyone seems to be playing pawn to g6 to stop it. Yeah, this stops the immediate threat here. They also can't mirror. So, one thing about these openings, they're just mirroring exactly what we are doing. They can't mirror the move queen to g4 because they'll just lose their queen if they brought it down here to g5. So they can't do that. They have to figure out, okay, now how do I change game plan here? The pawn's under attack. pretty easy to just play pawn to g6 here. Okay, that's fine. Knight or queen to f3, but they're almost always playing knight to f6. They recognize that the threat is queen to f7 checkmate, so no one wants to fall for that. So they know they need to get material involved into the game, and so they play knight to f6. And then we can play the move pawn to d4. And the reason why I like the whole setup is this move right here, because it's inviting them to take with their pawn. It's inviting them to take with their bishop. And both of those are going to be a mistake. And I always want to put my opponent in a position where they can make a mistake. So let's look at both of those options so you can see just the threat that white has. The first variation we're going to look at is the pawn takes here on d4. And we're going to push forward with e5, attacking this knight here on f6. And you can start to see that one of the main threats that we have here is if the knight moves, then black is going to lose the game. This bishop on c4 just putting so much pressure on this f7 square, and the queen is just eyeing this down. So it's almost pinning down the knight to a checkmate. So this is a weird way to think about a pin, but it definitely is pinning down that knight to a huge threat here. So how do they really continue from here? Well, pawn to d5, they really have to stop this bishop here. And from here, we could play bishop to g5, getting more pressure on our opponent. Now we're pinning down the knight to the queen, an actual immediate pin here. And so how do they continue? If they take with their pawn here on c4, just say, okay, we just have to take that bishop because we know that's an immediate threat here. Okay, well, that gets difficult because bishop takes here on f6, and this is attacking the queen and the rook. Black's going to go down a ton of material here and a pretty bad position. But if they don't, let's say instead, maybe knight to d7 says, okay, let's defend that material here. But as soon as they do, this knight here on d7 actually blocks off the queen from defending that pawn here on d5. So white takes this material. It still has that huge threat here. It's pinning down the knight, so the knight can't move back. It still loses to queen to f7 checkmate. And so the pawn can take here. The bishop can take here. You have three pieces, the queen, pawn, and the bishop, all eyeing down this f6 square, and black only has two pieces to defend it. So that's not going to go well either. Now, if we come back and say, what if the pawn doesn't take here? What if the bishop takes instead? In this case, our move order is going to be a little bit different because before we just push forward with e5, we don't have that option, but we can still have a huge pin, and that is the bishop here to g5. Same thing, the knight can't move because then we could just play queen to f7 checkmate. So how do they really continue from here? They really have to play something like d5. Everything else is going to lose because just bishop takes on f6. This is going to attack the queen and the rook. That's going to go poorly. So d5 makes the most sense. I'll show you what d6 looks like as well. It's going to be bad, but pawn to d5. Okay, well now we can just play the move pawn to c3. And the reason we play pawn to c3, first we have to look at what happens if we don't. So if we just take bishop here to f6, okay, well now they could just play pawn to e4, taking that pawn. They're attacking our queen. We're attacking their queen. They're not under check, so they're not going to lose the game. So bishop takes here. They take our queen. We don't have the threat anymore of checkmate. And so now it just comes down to an exchange and who wins that exchange. So knight takes on f3, bishop takes on b2, and you can see that's a critical square that we don't want to lose here. Bishop to f6, attacking the rook. They can castle. Maybe bishop takes on e5, but then rook to e8, pinning down the bishop. Things are not very good, and you can see also the rook here on a1 is going to fall. So that's not the variation that we want to go down. Instead of taking with our bishop here on f6, we can first play the move pawn to c3, and things change drastically. Now they can't just play pawn takes here on e4, because now we can actually take with their queen up here. And if they take with their queen, okay, we take with our bishop here on f6, attacking the rook. They still castle on the king side, but now we take with their pawn, they take, and now we take with our bishop. And you can see we are miles ahead of them. We have two of their minor pieces. They have none of our minor pieces, and we should have a pretty easy game in this spot. So they're probably not going to take with their pawn here on e4 after this position, but then what else do? They could take this bishop here on c4. but still they're going to lose because we can just take this knight here on f6. So that's what happens if they play d5. It's not really a good option. If they play d6, things are just bad because we could just take their knight here on f6, and you can see attacking the queen and the rook. That's a fork that they're not able to deal with. So that's why I really like setting up this position, because you just run into that g6 and the knight to f6, and then after pawn to d4, they just don't know how to deal with it, and both of the options with the pawn and the bishop taking it are going to be a huge mistake. So that's reason enough for me to go ahead and get my queen involved into the game with queen to g4. But that is the bishop's opening. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you haven't already, please hit that like button. Definitely helps out the channel a lot. If there are other videos, sometimes I think I've made videos for openings and I just haven't. So let me know in the comments below, or you can always reach out to me via email. But thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video.